I want to be honest with you. When I recorded the first draft of this account, I deleted it. Twice. Because the words kept coming out wrong, too clean, too organized, too much like something written by someone who wasn't terrified when it happened. And I was terrified. Every officer in that bunker was. I don't want to pretty that up. So I'm starting over. Again. And I'm going to tell you what I actually saw, what I actually felt, what the air actually smelled like in those final hours before everything changed. Because if I let the official language take over, if I start writing in coalition standard military narrative form, with its clean bullet points and its sanitized emotional registries, then you'll miss the thing that actually matters. You'll miss the moment the humans arrived. And that moment deserves to be told right. My name is Vainaratu. I was a third-class observer attached to the 14th Galactic Coalition Expeditionary Force. My job for the first 7 months of the Keth Expanse Campaign was simple: watch, record, transmit. I sat in mobile command stations behind the front lines, monitoring sensor feeds, transcribing officer communications, flagging anomalies in tactical data for the senior analysts. I was not a soldier. I had never been a soldier. I had 4 eyes, 3-chambered lungs, and a biology so thoroughly unsuited to combat that the Coalition's physical fitness standards for my species literally categorized us under support personnel, non-combat designation, fragile. That word, fragile, was on my official service file. I thought about that word a lot, sitting in Delta 9, listening to the bunker walls vibrate. The Keth Expanse, for those who weren't following the campaign, is a stretch of space that doesn't look like much on a star chart. 17 inhabited systems, mostly mid-development civilizations, spread across a relatively thin arm of the galaxy. The Vreth Dominion wanted it. The Coalition didn't want the Dominion to have it. And so, for 3 years before I arrived, there had been war. By the time I was posted to the 14th Expeditionary Force, the war had been going badly for 11 months. Not badly like we're losing some ground. Badly like we are being methodically dismantled, and the Dominion knows it, and we know it, and the only question left is how long we can make the process painful enough that they negotiate instead of annihilate. That kind of badly. The Vreth weren't a species known for negotiating. Let me tell you about the Vreth for a moment, because understanding what we were up against matters. They are, by almost every biological metric, superior combat organisms. I don't say that with any particular admiration. I say it the way you might say that a sandstorm is good at destroying things. It's just what they do. They average 2 meters 20 in height, with dense musculature layered over an internal skeleton of something close to reinforced cartilage that makes them nearly impossible to break with conventional impact weapons. Their nervous system processes pain signals on a significant delay, meaning that a wound that would drop most sentient beings doesn't register for them for several seconds. They operate in low oxygen. They function with almost no sleep for extended periods. They have been a militarized species for 6,000 years, and every generation of that 6,000 years was spent refining the biological and tactical machinery of war. They weren't monsters, I want to be clear about that. They were soldiers, extraordinarily, terrifyingly effective soldiers. And they had outnumbered us, the combined coalition forces, by a ratio of roughly 3-to-1 since the campaign's 3rd week. The morning everything changed. I woke up on the floor of Delta 9 because my bunk had been repurposed as a makeshift surgical table sometime during the night. I didn't notice at first. I just lay there on the cold metal floor, staring up at the bunker ceiling, listening to the percussion of artillery in the distance and counting the intervals between impacts. A habit I'd developed without meaning to. If the intervals got shorter, the front line was collapsing. If they got longer, we were maybe holding. That morning, the intervals were getting shorter. I sat up. The bunker was different from how I'd left it 6 hours earlier. More crowded somehow, not with personnel but with weight. There's a feeling in a command post when the situation has deteriorated overnight, and you don't need to check the tactical screens to feel it. It's in the posture of the people. The way no one is standing up straight. The way voices are lower than they need to be, like people conserving something. Senior Tactical Officer HFY was standing at the main holographic display with her back to me, and even from behind, I could see the tension in every line of her body. She's Yulani. Her species has these luminescent patches along their necks that shift color based on autonomic stress responses. HFY's neck was doing something I'd never seen it do before. A deep, cycling purple that the Yulani physiological database described as pre-dissolution panic state. I found out later that meant something close to what humans call existential dread. She was looking at a tactical map that was approximately 40% red, where yesterday it had been 60% blue. I got up, found a corner that wasn't occupied by wounded personnel or abandoned equipment, and pulled up my own observer terminal. The data was all there, the same data she was looking at, and I read it the way you read something you already know is going to be bad. The 3rd and 7th Coalition Armored Divisions had been engaged simultaneously at 2 points on the northern perimeter, a coordinated double strike that our tactical models had assessed at 11% probability. The Vreth had pulled it off cleanly. The 3rd was broken, not retreating, not reorganizing, broken, which in military terminology means the unit has ceased to function as a cohesive force. The 7th was pulling back to secondary positions and losing ground faster than the secondary positions could be established. In the east, the Coalition Naval Support Wing, the ships that had been providing orbital fire coverage for our ground forces, had been engaged by a Vreth deep space flanking element that nobody had seen coming. 2 destroyers confirmed destroyed. The flagship, Unyielding Principle, was still operational, but had ceased fire coverage operations to deal with the immediate threat. On the ground, without orbital support, our positions in sectors 4 through 7 were. Actually, I'll just say it plainly. Without orbital support, we were going to be overrun. There was no model, no tactical configuration, no repositioning that changed that outcome. The senior analysts had been running probability assessments all night, and the best number anyone had produced was 9% survival probability for forward ground personnel if the Vreth launched a sustained push in the next 18 hours. 9%. I sat with that number for a while. HFY called a command briefing at 700 local. There were 11 officers in the room, and I was the only non-combat designated person present, which told me something about how few people were left to fill the room. The briefing lasted 47 minutes. I have the full transcript in my observer logs, but I'll summarize it the way I experienced it. 47 minutes of increasingly senior officers arriving at the same conclusion through different routes. The routes were detailed, technical, filled with military vocabulary that I had to cross-reference in real time to follow. But the conclusion was always the same. We had lost this campaign. Not we are losing, not the situation is critical. We had lost, past tense. The math was done. The only open question was what the coalition did next, whether we attempted an organized withdrawal, which the tactical model said had a roughly 30% chance of succeeding before the Vreth closed the extraction corridor, or whether we held current positions and sent an emergency beacon to Coalition Command requesting immediate reinforcement. Reinforcement from where? Asked Ground Commander Thessalior, who had the flat, exhausted voice of someone who had been awake for 30 hours. The nearest uncommitted coalition force is the 6th Expeditionary, and they're 22 standard days out at maximum drive. Silence. What about the human contingent? Said someone near the back of the room. The silence changed. I need to pause here and give you some context, because if you're reading this as someone unfamiliar with the coalition's internal politics, The silence that followed that question might seem strange. The human contingent. At that point in coalition history, this was roughly 4 years after humanity's formal admission to the Galactic Coalition. The question of what role human military personnel should play in actual combat operations was still very much a live debate. Humans had been admitted to the coalition on the basis of their technological trajectory and their demonstrated capacity for interstellar travel, not on the basis of their combat record. In fact, their combat record was part of the debate, not because it was poor, but because it was alarming. Humans are, as a species, one of the strangest evolutionary outliers in the known galaxy. They evolved on a high-gravity, high-radiation, biologically aggressive world. They are parasitized by dozens of organisms throughout their lives and develop immunity rather than succumbing. They experience pain the way all complex nervous system organisms do, but their relationship to pain under stress is, there's no diplomatic way to say this, abnormal. Multiple species in the coalition have cognitive mechanisms that register extreme pain and trigger immediate behavioral modification towards survival preservation. Humans have this mechanism too, but they also have a secondary override system that, under sufficient psychological conditions, duty, protection of others, rage, what they call desperation, can suppress it almost entirely. The scientific literature called this pain tolerance under high-stakes emotional conditions. In practice, it meant that humans, when sufficiently motivated, could take wounds that would incapacitate most sentient species and keep going. There were other things, I'll get to them. The point is, humans had been in the coalition for 4 years, and in those 4 years, coalition military brass had been very careful about how they deployed human combat units, partly out of genuine uncertainty about how to integrate a new species into established tactics, partly out of political considerations. Humanity's admission had been controversial, and several coalition member species weren't comfortable with what they saw as rapid militarization of a new member. And partly, if I'm honest, out of something that looked a lot like fear, not of humans specifically, more of what it meant that humans were the way they were. The officer who'd asked about the human contingent was a young Thressi, a species with translucent skin, so I could literally see his cardiac rate spiking when the silence stretched out. His name was Tactical Analyst Corvathune, and he looked immediately like he wished he hadn't spoken. The 1st Human Expeditionary Battalion is currently assigned to rear security operations in Sector 12, said J. Halviros, without turning from the tactical display. Her voice was very controlled. They are not configured for front-line assault operations. Neither are we anymore, said Corvathune, quietly. Another silence. J. Halviros turned. She looked at Corvathune for a long moment. I watched that purple cycling on her neck, then she looked at Thessalior. Get me a communication line to Human Battalion Commander, she paused, consulting something on her personal screen. Rhodes, Commander Rhodes. I didn't hear that conversation. I wasn't cleared for it. But I watched J. Halviros's face through the transparent wall of the comm room while it happened, and I saw something I'd never seen on a Yulani before. J. Halviros was a decorated officer. She'd served in 3 prior campaigns. She had earned her rank in the traditional Yulani fashion, which involved a combination of academic excellence and battlefield assessment, and something their culture called moral weight, a quality assessed by your peers that roughly translated to dignity under pressure. While she talked to Commander Rhodes, her neck patches went from purple to something I had to look up afterward. The color was called, in Yulani physiological taxonomy, reluctant hope. I had never seen it before. I haven't seen it since. The next 4 hours were the strangest of the campaign. J. Halviros didn't announce anything right away. She came back into the main bunker, spoke quietly with Thessalior, and then the two of them began doing something that I gradually realized was reorganizing our defensive positions, not for withdrawal, for holding. I watched the tactical overlay shift. Units that had been configured for retreat and delay were being repositioned into something that looked more like a perimeter defense. A serious perimeter defense. I pulled up the personnel logs and looked at sector assignments, and that's when I noticed it. Sector 7's rear access corridor, the passage through the highland terrain that had been considered our last clean extraction route, had just been assigned new security, not coalition standard units. The marker designations were different, unfamiliar format. I cross-referenced the designator codes. 1st Human Expeditionary Battalion. Forward Assault Elements, Companies Alpha, Bravo, and Delta. ETA to Sector 7 forward positions, 3 hours 40 minutes. I sat back and looked at that for a long time. Then I went and found a ration pack, ate something I couldn't taste, and decided to go outside. Chapter 2, Things I Noticed While Waiting. The area around Delta 9 Command Station had the particular atmosphere of a place that has been preparing for bad news for so long that the bad news arriving would almost be a relief. It was mid-morning, local time. The planet Keth 4, the primary inhabited world of the contested Keth system, had a sun that ran slightly orange, and the light it threw across the highland terrain was the kind that made everything look slightly unreal, like a painting where the artist wasn't quite sure about the colors. The hills rolled away to the north in long brown-green waves. The Vreth were somewhere past those hills, and every few minutes the northern horizon would flicker and pulse with weapons fire. I stood outside the bunker entrance and watched those flickers. Coalition soldiers moved around me, supply runners, medical personnel, communications technicians. The sounds were a layered thing. The distant percussion of the front, the closer noise of vehicles and equipment, the quieter sound of people talking and the careful low voices of people who aren't sure which words are appropriate anymore. A soldier from the Chelani species, tall, gray-green skin, huge compound eyes, stopped near me and stood watching the northern flickers for a moment. "You heard," she said. "Heard what?" I said. "About the humans coming up." I saw the assignment data. She made a sound that I took from context to mean something between "well" and "I guess we'll see." Then she moved on. "I want to tell you about something that happened an hour later, because it's the kind of small thing that, in my memory, is somehow as significant as the battle itself." A supply convoy came through the access road heading north. Standard resupply run, ammunition, medical goods, power cell packages, coalition vehicles, coalition drivers. Routine. Except trailing the convoy was a cluster of non-standard vehicles. They were larger than coalition military transports, blockier. They had what I recognized from my xenosociological databases as human engineering aesthetic, something about the proportion of function to form, an almost aggressive simplicity in the design, like someone had asked what a vehicle needed to do and then built exactly that without additional consideration of elegance. Heavy plating, wide tires suited to the highland terrain, and they were moving fast. Faster than the coalition convoy, faster than the road conditions really warranted. The soldiers around me stopped what they were doing and watched. The humans disembarked in a way that was different from how coalition units moved. I'm not sure I can fully describe the difference. Coalition military doctrine emphasizes synchronized movement. Units move on coordinated signals, which produces a visual rhythm that is professional, precise, and has a certain aesthetic quality. Humans moved like water finding a path. Quickly, with constant small adjustments, spreading into available space with an instinctive efficiency that didn't look rehearsed because it wasn't really a single coordinated movement at all. It was dozens of individual humans, each making rapid individual decisions that somehow produced an organized outcome. They were medium-height creatures on average, not as tall as Vreth, bipedal. They wore coalition-standard atmospheric gear but had modified it, extra attachments, non-regulation additions that I recognized as personal equipment. Several of them had what I would later learn were good luck items, physical objects with no tactical function that they carried for psychological reasons. Humans apparently do this. They moved through the area around Delta 9 with a focused calm that was somehow louder than noise. I noticed that the coalition soldiers who were watching them had different expressions. Some were confused, some were assessing. A few looked the way J. Halviros's neck had looked, that reluctant hope color. And one young Thressi soldier, not Corvathune, a different one, was staring with an expression I could only describe as deeply relieved that someone had arrived. One of the humans stopped near me. She was shorter than average for her species. I had been reviewing human anthropometric data, so I had reference points. Dark hair cut practically short. Eyes the color of the local soil, that brownish amber. She was looking at her handheld tactical device and then looking up at the terrain, back and forth, with the specific focused energy of someone building a mental map. She noticed me noticing her. "Observer," she said. She had looked at the designation on my vest without appearing to look directly at me, which was impressive. "Third Class, Vainer Ratu. Lieutenant Commander Sioyon Park, Alpha Company." She looked back at the terrain. "You've been here long." 7 months. "Good, I need someone who knows the ground." She didn't wait for my agreement. "Walk with me." I walked with her. She asked questions quickly. Not the broad strategic questions I'd expected. She'd clearly already been briefed on the strategic situation. She wanted specific things. What was the soil composition in the highland approaches? Was it load-bearing for heavy vehicles, or did it become unstable in the way that several types of highland terrain do after extended artillery vibration? Were there any underground water channels that could affect tunnel stability in the sector? What was the typical wind pattern in the late afternoon, and did it channel through the highland passes in a way that would affect ballistic trajectories? I answered everything I could. She listened without interrupting, and she had a way of listening that made me feel like everything I said was being mapped and filed somewhere efficient. "The Vreth are going to come through the northern passes," she said at one point, not as a question. "Our tactical models suggest." Not asking about models, asking what you've seen. "You've watched them for 7 months. How do they think?" I stopped walking. I realized, standing there on the orange-lit highland ground with the distant artillery still pulsing, that no one had asked me that in 7 months. My job was to record and transmit, not to interpret, not to think about the Vreth as thinking beings. "They are methodical," I said slowly. "They favor certainty over speed. When they identify a weakness, they develop it systematically rather than exploiting it immediately. Their engagement with the northern positions over the last 3 days has felt like preparation, like they are removing obstacles rather than advancing." She nodded slowly. "They're staging." "I believe so." "For a full push." "Yes." She looked at the northern horizon. The flickers were still there, still occasional. "When?" "Based on pattern analysis, sometime in the next 12 to 18 hours. She nodded again, and something happened in her face that I couldn't quite read. Not fear, not quite. "Good," she said. "Then we have time to set up properly." She said it like good was the actual right word for the situation. Like our 12 to 18-hour window before the potentially war-ending Vreth assault was an asset to be used, not a countdown to dread. I thought about that later. I thought about it a lot. Chapter 3: What they brought with them. The 1st Human Expeditionary Battalion, all 3 assault companies, plus their support elements, finished arriving in the forward area by early afternoon. 712 personnel. I looked it up. Against the Vreth force, that our sensors estimated at approximately 11,000. I am not a mathematician in the military sense, but I understood what those numbers meant. What I didn't understand yet was what the humans understood about those numbers. I had access to the tactical planning channel as an observer, which meant I could listen to the human command elements coordinate with HFY's staff. What struck me, listening to those communications, was the texture of the conversation. Coalition planning conversations had a particular rhythm, formal, structured, built around established doctrine. When officers disagreed, the disagreement was expressed through protocol. Counterproposals submitted in proper format, alternative models presented with statistical backing, hierarchy observed at every step. The human commanders talked differently. They interrupted each other. They used colloquial language mid-briefing. At one point, a disagreement between Lieutenant Commander Park and one of the other company commanders, a large, heavy-framed man named Captain Torres, became briefly heated, with both of them talking simultaneously and neither backing down until Park said something sharp and Torres laughed and said, "Yeah, fine, you're Reed." And they moved on. They moved on in about 90 seconds. A similar disagreement in a coalition planning session would have taken 20 minutes of protocol. I noticed that HFY was quiet during the human planning exchanges, just listening. Her neck was doing something I'd never quite seen before, not the panic purple from earlier, not the reluctant hope color either. Something between them, something that looked almost like she was calibrating. Commander Rhodes, the human battalion commander, a man I hadn't met yet, was walking around the room while everyone else sat, not pacing nervously, more like he couldn't think properly while stationary. He had the build of someone who had been physically imposing once and had moved past imposing into something denser, gray at the temples. A scar across the left side of his jaw that his species often left unrepaired, which I'd read was sometimes a choice about memory. He stopped walking when he was in front of the tactical display. "Here's what we're doing," he said, and the room went quiet. He laid it out in 11 minutes. What I transcribed was this: rather than holding the current perimeter, which the Vreth would simply grind through, the humans were going to do something the tactical models had literally not included as an option because it fell outside the probability range of actions a rational military force would take. They were going to advance. Not retreat and hold, not defensive perimeter. They were going to move toward the Vreth staging area and engage them before the full assault could consolidate. 712 humans into approximately 11,000 Vreth. One of the coalition staff officers, I think it was a Hreni, a four-armed species known for their tactical precision, said, very carefully, "Commander Rhodes, the force differential." "Yep," said Rhodes. "Does not support offensive engagement at this ratio. Our own models." "Your models don't account for what we're going to do," said Rhodes, not unkindly, very directly. A silence. "What are you going to do?" asked the Hreni. Rhodes looked at him for a second. "Whatever it takes," he said. I wrote that down in my personal log with 3 underlines, which I never do. Chapter 4, The Hours Before. The rest of that afternoon was a kind of organized quiet storm. The humans prepared the way I imagine certain natural phenomena prepare, not with fanfare but with thorough, focused energy that you could feel without being able to directly observe. They checked their equipment in ways that seemed personal rather than procedural. They talked to each other in small clusters, not war talk from what I could hear. Regular talk, ordinary things, what they ate for their last meal, something funny that had happened during the transit. Complaints about equipment that weren't really complaints, but were a way of being familiar with each other. I walked among them for a while in my observer capacity. Nobody stopped me. A young soldier, barely past the developmental threshold for his species, which for humans meant around 19 or 20 years of age, was sitting against one of their vehicles, writing something on physical paper. Actual paper. I hadn't seen anyone write on paper in years. I almost asked him about it, then I didn't. It felt private. Captain Torres was running his company through a final equipment check, and there was something about the way he talked to them that I kept trying to find the right word for. He knew their names, obviously. He would know his soldiers' names, but it wasn't that. It was the way he used them. Every interaction had a personal weight. When he stopped to check a soldier's equipment, he talked about that soldier's equipment, referencing something specific, something individual. When he made a correction, he made it feel like information rather than critique. When he moved on, the soldier he'd just spoken to stood fractionally straighter. He did this 300 times in the span of an hour. I have observed many military commanders in 7 months. I have never seen one work the way Torres worked that hour. Lieutenant Commander Park was the opposite. She barely moved, sitting in front of her tactical screen, running simulations that she clearly wasn't satisfied with because she kept resetting them. Every so often she'd reach for a thermos and drink something that smelled burnt and chemical, the caffeinated beverage that humans use with such frequency that the Coalition Supply Corps had added it to standard human field rations. Coffee. She drank it like it was medicine. At one point, she looked up and caught me watching her. She didn't say anything critical, just, "You're going to record all of this." "That's my function." She looked at me for a moment. "Good, someone should." Commander Rhodes found me at around 1800 local, with 3 hours until the human advance was scheduled to begin. He sat down near me, on a crate, the way humans often choose informal sitting positions even when formal ones are available, and looked at the northern horizon. The flickers had been continuous for the last hour, not louder, just more constant. The Vreth were moving things around. "You speak to the Vreth at any point?" he asked. "Communication attempts were made in the early campaign," I said. "They were not reciprocated." "What do you make of them?" "As a species. As enemies." I thought about how to answer. "They are thorough," I said finally. "They do not leave things undone." Rhodes nodded. "That's what I figured." "You've engaged Vreth before?" "No, but I've read everything the Coalition has on them." He paused. "The pain delay thing is interesting. It gives them a significant combat advantage." "Does it?" He didn't say it skeptically, more like he was genuinely considering it. "They can continue functioning through wound that would cause most species to become non-functional." "Yeah, but then the pain hits all at once." He looked at the horizon again. "That's a lot of accumulated signal." I hadn't thought about it from that angle. "You're saying it could become a liability." "I'm saying I find it interesting." He stood up. "How's your medical training?" "Basic Coalition emergency protocols." "Good. Stay near the command post during the engagement. You may be needed." He put a hand on my shoulder briefly, a human gesture of, I believe, acknowledgement, and walked away. I looked at his back until he was gone. I had just been told, by the commander of the force that was about to do something statistically improbable, to stay near the command post and be ready to help with the wounded. It occurred to me, sitting there on that crate with the northern sky flickering, that Commander Rhodes fully expected his people to take wounds tonight. And he was going anyway. I have thought about what that means, about that particular quality of leadership, for the 4 years since. I still don't think I've found all the words for it. They went out at 2100 local. There was no ceremony, no speech from Rhodes, no rallying address, no moment designed for posterity. He checked his communications, said something brief into his command channel, and the 3 companies moved out of the forward area and into the Highland Dark. 712 humans. I watched them go from the bunker entrance, and I'll tell you what I noticed. They moved quietly. Humans are not naturally silent creatures. Their biology doesn't particularly equip them for silence, not the way some species are. but they chose silence with a collective discipline that I wouldn't have predicted. The sounds they made were small: equipment, footfall, breathing, nothing else. The last one out was Captain Torres. He paused at the perimeter edge, looked back at the command post, found me in the dark somehow, and gave a small nod. Then he was gone. What I'm about to describe comes from 3 sources: my own direct observation from the Delta IX elevated sensor array, the tactical communication feed I was monitoring, and the personal helmet camera recordings from 43 human soldiers that were compiled after the engagement. I was given access to those recordings during the after-action review. I've tried to put together a coherent account from all 3. The problem is that what happened in the next 7 hours doesn't fit together neatly, because war isn't a neat thing, and this particular engagement was less neat than most. Things happened simultaneously that I can only describe sequentially. Decisions were made in seconds that I've taken hours to understand. People did things that I can describe accurately, but cannot fully explain. I'll do my best. The humans crossed approximately 3 kilometers of highland terrain in the first 90 minutes, moving without active illumination, using their equipment's passive sensor systems. The terrain was rough, broken ground, scattered rock formations, the kind of highland topography that channels movement into predictable paths if you aren't careful. They were careful. On the tactical feed, I watched Park's position marker moving through the terrain with the small corrections of someone navigating by feel as much as by sensor data. She'd been right to ask about the soil conditions. The highland ground in that sector had been vibrated by 3 days of artillery, and in several areas it had developed the subsurface instability I'd warned about: looser soil on top, hollow spaces forming underneath in the water channel areas. The kind of ground that could drop a heavy vehicle. Human soldiers, weighing considerably less than Vreth combat frames, moved across it without incident. The Vreth hadn't accounted for that. I watched their sensor sweep patterns. We had passive access to their general scanning rhythms, and they were configured for vehicle-scale movement. Infantry moving quietly across vibrated highland ground in the dark simply wasn't registering as a threat signature. 700 humans walked into the Vreth staging area's outer perimeter like the terrain itself was helping them. The first contact happened at 2247 local. A 3-soldier Vreth outpost at the edge of the staging area. They spotted an anomaly. One of Park's scouts had gotten slightly upwind, and the Vreth have excellent olfactory capability. The outpost signaled an alert. In my experience of this campaign, when the Vreth signaled an alert, the response was methodical: establish the threat, assess the threat, respond appropriately. The whole process from initial alert to full response typically took between 4 and 7 minutes. The humans didn't give them 4 minutes. From the moment the outpost signaled to the moment the first Vreth staging camp came under engagement, by my precise timestamp, was 2 minutes and 9 seconds. I've reviewed the recording of that first contact many times. What you see is, it's hard to describe if you've never seen humans in the specific state they enter when things go active. There's a quality to how they move that changes, like the careful, measured energy of the preparation phase compresses into something else, something faster and more direct. The precision doesn't go away, it accelerates. Alpha Company hit the eastern staging camp from 2 angles simultaneously. Bravo Company went for the communications array, on the reasoning which Park had explained in the planning session, that the Vreth response to an unexpected engagement would be to call for additional forces, and slowing that call was worth almost any other objective. Delta Company set up in the ridge terrain above the staging area and did something that took me several viewings of the recordings to fully understand. They started making noise. Not random noise. Specific noise, coordinated sounds designed to suggest a force much larger than 700 soldiers. calibrated radio frequency transmissions on the Vreth military band that mimicked a large unit's communication patterns. Thermal signature grenades positioned to show on Vreth passive sensors as additional heat sources. Movement patterns that, read by a sensor system looking for a formation, would suggest battalions rather than companies. The Vreth outpost commander, in those first chaotic minutes, was apparently not trying to assess 700 humans. He was assessing what appeared to be several thousand. His response was, tactically speaking, entirely correct for facing several thousand. He began a staged withdrawal toward his secondary defensive positions, pulling in his perimeter forces to consolidate before counterattacking. Which was exactly what Park had predicted and had planned for. What happened next is the part I still find hardest to describe, because it doesn't fit any tactical framework I was trained to apply. Coalition military doctrine doesn't have a category for it. The Vreth, based on their own after-action accounts, which were obtained through intelligence channels after the campaign ended, didn't have a category for it either. The humans followed the consolidating Vreth forces directly. Not at a distance, not cautiously. They followed them in, pressing the withdrawal so closely that the Vreth couldn't fully establish their secondary positions before the humans were already engaging them. It was, the human phrase for this tactic is to not give an inch. Or another one they used was staying on their heels. In practice, it meant that the Vreth force, which outnumbered the humans 15-1, never got to use that numerical advantage the way it was designed to be used. Numerical superiority requires space. You need room to deploy your larger force, to bring your weight of numbers to bear. The humans simply didn't give them the room. Every time a Vreth unit tried to establish a position from which to counterattack, the humans were already inside that position's engagement perimeter. It was chaos, by any objective measure. 700 humans inside the defensive formations of 11,000 Vreth, with the two forces essentially intermixed across a 3-kilometer front. And here's the thing that I've spent 4 years trying to explain to people who weren't there. The chaos favored the humans. Not because they were better equipped, not because they were individually stronger. A Vreth in close combat is a physiologically terrifying opponent. But because the humans had, in some way I don't fully understand, already processed the chaos as a possibility and decided how to function inside it. The individual recordings show soldiers making decisions at a speed that suggests they weren't waiting for orders. They weren't following a rigid plan. They were operating on a shared understanding of the objective: disrupt, disorganize, do not allow the Vreth to consolidate, and then adapting to the specific circumstances in front of them in real time. A human soldier named Corporal Davies, I learned her name from the recording, found herself separated from her unit in the confusion of the first camp engagement. She was alone, in the dark, with 3 Vreth between her and the rest of her squad. The recording shows exactly 12 seconds of stillness. She was assessing, I believe, building a picture, and then she did something that made the Vreth intelligence analysts who watched the recording request a biological review of human decision-making processes. She didn't go around the Vreth, she didn't retreat, she went through them. Not because she didn't understand the danger. She clearly understood the danger. You can hear her breathing on the audio. But she had calculated in those 12 seconds that going through them was the fastest route to rejoining her squad, and rejoining her squad was the correct action, and therefore going through was what she was going to do. She made it. She had significant injuries afterward. She kept going. I was monitoring the tactical feed from Delta 9, and I need to tell you what those hours were like from my vantage point, because it's different from the recordings. The recordings show individual moments of extraordinary clarity, decisions, actions, human and Vreth in sharp, focused detail. From the tactical feed, it was a churning mass of data points, moving fast, with the numbers that represented human soldiers sometimes disappearing, which meant dead or communications lost, and I couldn't always tell which, and the numbers that represented Vreth sometimes stopping, which meant something else. Jehal Viro stood next to me for most of the engagement. She had stopped trying to manage the tactical situation in real time because there was nothing for her to manage. The humans were operating too fast for coalition command protocols to be relevant. She was watching like me. At one point, around 100 local, roughly 4 hours into the engagement, she said something to me quietly. "Eratu." "Yes, Commander." "Is this?" And she stopped. "What is this?" I didn't have a clean answer. "I believe this is how humans fight," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "We should have asked them to do this 11 months ago." I didn't say anything to that. Chapter 6, Rhodes. I need to tell you about what Commander Rhodes was doing during those hours. He wasn't at Delta 9 with us. He'd gone forward with his command element, 3 soldiers and a communications specialist, to a position about 800 meters behind the engagement line. Not because he needed to be closer than the tactical feed could provide. He went forward because he needed to be available. His soldiers could reach him in under 10 minutes from almost anywhere in the engagement area. He knew that. From the communication logs, he spent those hours doing something I wouldn't have predicted. He was listening, not directing, not issuing orders. He had established the plan, trusted his company commanders to execute it, and was now keeping himself available for the moments when the plan collided with reality and someone needed immediate authority to adapt. Those moments came. At 23, Captain Tor's Bravo Company hit a communications array that was more heavily defended than the intelligence suggested. There were 4 Vreth combat units stationed around it rather than the one the sensors had indicated, and Tor's was taking heavy fire trying to reach the objective. He needed options. Rhodes heard the situation report and responded in under 30 seconds. "Don't fight for the array. Fall back to secondary objective, maintain engagement pressure on eastern flank. Let the array alone. The primary objective is disruption, not the equipment. Don't lose people for equipment." Tor's pivoted. The recordings show Bravo Company pulling back from the array position, with the efficiency of soldiers who have complete trust in the order they've just received. Not because they don't have doubts, but because the order came from someone they trust to make that call. At 1:14, a situation arose that wasn't in the planning at all. A Vreth unit, moving in the confusion, stumbled into a cluster of coalition support personnel who had been in a forward medical station that was now inside the engagement area. 4 medics, no combat capacity. The closest human unit was a 4-soldier element from Alpha Company, led by a sergeant named Mackand. He reported the situation to Park, who relayed to Rhodes. In the recording, the entire exchange from Mackand's initial report to Rhodes's response takes 11 seconds. "Get them out," Rhodes said. "Sir, we're exposed." "Get them out, Mackand. Then get yourself out. The rest of the company will cover." "Yes, sir." The recordings from Mackand's helmet show what happened next. He moved his 4 soldiers through fire to reach the medical station. He and his soldiers formed a physical screen around the 4 medics, not a tactical formation, literally placing their armored bodies between the medics and the incoming fire. They walked out of the kill zone. All 4 medics survived. 2 of Mackand's soldiers were wounded during the extraction. Both recovered. Rhodes was told the extraction was successful. He said good and moved to the next situation. Chapter 7, The Thing That Changed the VRETA. It happened at approximately 2:30. The Vreth commander, I learned his name later. It was a rank title rather than a personal name, rendered roughly as Advanced Prime Kedesh, had been trying to establish a coherent picture of what he was facing for over 5 hours. His initial assessment of a large coalition force had been revised several times. By 2:30, his intelligence picture was approximately accurate. He knew he was facing a smaller human force than he had initially estimated. He still didn't fully know how small. But here's what had happened to his force in those 5 hours. It had been fragmented. Not destroyed, the Vreth casualties up to that point were significant but not catastrophic, particularly given the force ratio. What had happened was more damaging than casualties. The coherence of his 11,000-strong force had been disrupted. Units that should have been coordinating were instead reacting to local threats. Communication between his unit commanders had been degraded. Partly the work Bravo Company had done against his communications infrastructure, but mainly just the effect of 5 hours of chaotic, high-intensity engagement, where every unit was dealing with its own immediate situation. He was commanding 11,000 soldiers, who had stopped functioning as 11,000 soldiers. This is, I learned after the campaign, a concept humans call defeating the enemy's mind. The idea that a force's effectiveness is not just its numbers or its weapons, but the coherent decision-making structure that connects those numbers and weapons into a unified whole. Disrupt the decision-making structure, and you have reduced a large force to a collection of smaller forces that can be engaged piece by piece. The humans had done this in 5 hours. Not through superior strength, not through superior numbers, through speed, unpredictability, and an absolute refusal to behave the way a rational military doctrine predicted they would behave. At 2:30, Kadesh made a decision. He attempted to execute a withdrawal to his primary defensive positions, the fortified ridgeline 7 kilometers north of the staging area. An orderly withdrawal under fire is one of the most difficult military operations to execute. It requires coordination. It requires units to hold their positions long enough for adjacent units to move, then leapfrog through, over and over. It requires a coherent command structure. The withdrawal began to fracture almost immediately. Units that were still engaged with human elements couldn't hold their positions long enough for adjacent units to move. Human soldiers who were too far into the Vreth formation to safely disengage, and there were many of them by this point, pressed forward into the withdrawal movement rather than pulling back. The recordings of this phase are the ones I find most difficult to watch. Not because of the violence, because of what the violence reveals about the humans experiencing it. They were exhausted. They had been in continuous high-intensity engagement for over 5 hours. Several were wounded. All of them were running on reserves of something that I eventually understood was not exactly physical energy. They had passed through physical energy some time ago, but something psychological. A kind of stubborn insistence that they were not done, that the situation had not yet reached the point where stopping was the right answer. I have reviewed physiological data from the recording sensors for 11 different soldiers during this phase. All of them showed cardiac rates, cortisol levels, and neurological stress markers that my species' medical databases classify as dangerous. Not uncomfortable, dangerous. They kept going. Chapter 8 Park. I want to tell you specifically about Lieutenant Commander Park in the final 2 hours. Park had been shot at 1:40. A Vreth energy weapon, partial contact, left arm and shoulder. The recording shows the impact, shows her going down, shows a 2-second assessment period. She was running her own injury, I think, doing a rapid self-inventory, and then she got up. She got up and kept commanding. She had her shoulder field dressed by a medic at 1:47, while simultaneously issuing tactical instructions for the Alpha Company repositioning. The medic told her, apparently, that she should not be commanding infantry operations with that wound. She said something brief in return. The audio quality isn't perfect in that section, but the transcription software rendered it as noted. Just noted. And moved on. For the next 2 hours, She managed the Alpha Company engagement with one functional arm, and the particular clarity of someone who has decided that nothing about the current situation gets to stop her from doing her job. Her communication on the tactical channel was the most precise I heard from anyone during the entire engagement, shorter sentences as she got more tired, but more accurate, more decisive. Like fatigue had stripped away everything that wasn't essential. At 3:15, she identified something on the sensor data that the rest of us had missed. The Vreth withdrawal was developing a gap, a natural consequence of the fracturing I described. One unit was retreating faster than adjacent units, leaving a section of the line thinner than it should have been. A gap maybe 200 meters wide, through which the human force could push directly into the withdrawal route. She reported it to Rhodes in 10 seconds. He confirmed in 5. "Take it," he said. She took it. Alpha Company moved through the gap with the last reserves of their forward speed, and what happened in the next 40 minutes was, I have read military history for the 4 years since this engagement, and I don't have a clean historical parallel for it. It was not a rout. The Vreth didn't panic. They're not built for panic. But it was a disorganization that cascaded through the remaining formations in a way that the Vreth command structure couldn't arrest. At 4:01 local time, Advanced Prime Kedesh transmitted a message to Vreth High Command. I have the translation in my archives. I'll give you the relevant section. Engagement with human forces at Keth Roman 4 staging area has produced unforeseen tactical outcomes. Recommend immediate reassessment of human military doctrine classification. Current classification as secondary combat assets is inaccurate. Request updated engagement protocols. Staging area operations suspended pending restructuring. Suspended pending restructuring. The Vreth were withdrawing from the staging area. The sun came up at 5:27 local time, throwing its orange light across the highland terrain. I drove out to the forward area with a medical convoy at 600. I wasn't supposed to. My observer designation was non-combat, non-forward, but J. Halviros told me to go, and she outranked anyone who would have stopped me. The staging area was, I want to find the right word. Quiet. The staging area was quiet. Vreth equipment abandoned in the withdrawal. Vehicles, supply containers, the infrastructure of a force that had been preparing a sustained assault and had instead spent a night being systematically disrupted until it no longer cohered as a force. There were signs everywhere of the engagement, scorched ground, displaced terrain, the physical residue of 5 hours of intense combat. The human soldiers were stopping. I don't have a better word. They were sitting, lying down in some cases. There was a stillness in them that looked like exhaustion so complete it had become something else. Most of them had their eyes open, looking at nothing in particular. A few were talking in low voices. Some were not moving at all, and those ones, I have to be honest, some of those ones were not going to move again. The human casualties in the engagement were significant, not catastrophic in a military sense. The unit was still functional as a fighting force, which is how military doctrine measures these things. But the number of people who went into the highlands the night before and did not come back to watch the sunrise was a number that mattered beyond doctrine. I walked among them. A young soldier was sitting with his back against a piece of abandoned Vreth equipment, holding a communication device. He wasn't transmitting. He was looking at something on the screen, a photograph, I thought, though I couldn't see it clearly. After a moment he put the device away and looked at the sky. Corporal Davies, the one from the recording, the one who went through instead of around, was having her wounds properly assessed by a medic. She had the distant look of someone in significant pain who has decided not to display it. She caught me looking and gave me a nod that I took to mean she was aware that I had seen the recording. I nodded back. Sergeant Mackand was sitting with his 4 soldiers. The 2 wounded ones had been stabilized, and they were sharing something from a container that I recognized as Field Rations coffee. They weren't talking. They were just sitting together, in the particular proximity of people who have been through the same thing and don't need to say much about it. I found Rhodes at the northern edge of the staging area, standing alone on a piece of high ground, looking north. He looked like he hadn't slept. He looked like he'd been on the edge of something very difficult and had come back from it, and was now standing in the aftermath of that. There were things in his face that I couldn't read completely. He's human, and I'm not, and some of what moves across a human face in moments like that doesn't translate directly. But some of it does. I stood next to him. We both looked north where the Vreth had gone. "It worked," I said. I wasn't sure what else to say. "Yeah," he said. "Your projections." "Didn't project." He glanced at me. "You don't project this kind of thing, you just go." I thought about that. Wasn't there a point where I stopped? Where it could have gone wrong? He looked back north. "Yep." "And you knew that going in?" "Yep." I didn't say anything. "There wasn't another option," he said, not explaining himself, more like stating something factual. The math of sitting and waiting was worse than the math of going. Most commanders in that situation didn't have my people. He said it simply, not arrogantly, with the particular weight of someone who means exactly what they're saying. I knew what they were capable of. That changes the math. 2 days after the engagement, with the Vreth having withdrawn from the Keth Roman 4 operational theater entirely, their high command had apparently decided that an 11,000-unit force failing to take a position against a 700-unit human element was a signal worth heeding. J. Halviros filed her campaign report. I was given access to the relevant section for this account. She wrote, in the Ulani language which has particular precision around emotional states, "The human contingent performed in a manner that cannot be categorized within existing coalition military doctrine. Their engagement pattern defied force differential expectations by a factor that our models would have classified as impossible before observing it. What we witnessed was not a superior technology or superior physical capacity. The individual human is not a superior combat organism by the metrics we use to assess such things. What we witnessed was something else, something in how they relate to difficulty, to the fact of facing something larger and harder and more dangerous than themselves. They do not process it as reason to stop. They appear to process it as information, data about what is required, and then they do what is required. I have served in the coalition military for 30 years. I have seen many species under combat conditions. I do not know what to call what the humans have, but I know that if I had called for them 11 months ago, we would not have spent 11 months losing. She filed this as part of an official campaign report. It went to Coalition Command, to the Military Integration Board, to the Human Coalition Relations Council. I know that it was read. I know that it contributed to a significant policy revision regarding the deployment classification of human military units. I know that Rhodes was informed of the report and that his response, according to the aide who relayed the information, was to say, "Tell her thank you. And tell her the coffee in this sector is terrible." 4 years later, I'm not a third-class observer anymore. The Keth campaign was the end of my field service, partly because the campaign itself ended, partly because of decisions I made during the engagement that put me outside my designated operational parameters in ways that my supervisors were inclined to overlook given the context, but that did formally close off certain career paths. I'm an analyst now. I read combat reports. I write assessments. I sit in offices that are much quieter than forward command bunkers, and I look at tactical data and I think about what it means. I still think about Delta 9. About the morning when the intervals between artillery impacts were getting shorter, and there were 11 officers in a briefing room arriving at the conclusion that the campaign was lost. And then someone asked about the human contingent. I think about what it means that the answer to the war was already lost turned out to be until the humans arrived. I've spent 4 years trying to understand what quality in them produced that answer. I've read the physiological studies, the psychological assessments, the evolutionary biology papers. They're all interesting. None of them feel quite complete. The closest I've come is something that Lieutenant Commander Park said to me, very briefly, in the after-action review. I asked her what she had thought when she was given the tactical picture. The 11,000 Vreth, the 700 humans, the command asking them to advance. She thought about it for a moment. I thought the situation is what it is, she said. And then I thought, okay, so what do we do with it? That was it. That was the whole answer. The situation is what it is. What do we do with it? I have thought about that sentence more times than I can count, because it contains something that I think is the real answer to the question I've been trying to answer for 4 years. It's not about physiology. It's not about pain tolerance or evolutionary history or the particular qualities of a death world species. It's about the verb, what do we do with it? Not how do we survive it? Not what is our probability of success? Not what are the models telling us? What do we do with it? As if the situation, any situation, no matter how bad, is simply the material you've been given to work with. As if impossible is just a word for something that hasn't been tried the right way yet. As if 700 people going into the dark against 11,000 is not a statistic to be assessed, but a choice to be made. I've never met another species that thinks quite that way. I'm not sure I'll ever fully understand it. But I was there. I watched it happen. I watched 700 humans decide that the war was not, in fact, already lost. And then I watched them go prove it.